Ethan was an 8-year-old boy with a deep sense of right and wrong. He always believed in protecting the people he cared about, even when it wasn't easy. One day, on what should have been the happiest moment of his father's life, Ethan made a choice that would change everything. As he watched his dad about to marry Emily, a woman with dark secrets she had hidden from everyone, Ethan made a bold move that no one saw coming. He stood up and revealed a shocking truth that brought the entire wedding to a halt. But what followed next was even more shocking, leaving everyone in disbelief. What was it about Ethan's revelation that led to such a dramatic turn of events? How did this brave boy manage to uncover the truth about his father's fiancée? And what consequences did his actions have on their lives? Let's explore the details of this story. The warm sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the small chapel, casting a soft, golden glow over the gathering. The room was alive with quiet excitement as friends and family whispered among themselves, their eyes glancing toward the entrance, waiting for the big moment to arrive. At the altar, David Matthews stood tall and confident in a crisp black tuxedo, his nervous smile showing just how eager he was. "You look great, Dad," whispered Ethan, who stood by his father's side, fidgeting with the small pillow he was carrying. His dark curly hair was neatly combed, and his tiny suit matched his father's perfectly. However, while David radiated happiness, Ethan's brown eyes were clouded with concern. David glanced down at his son and gave him a reassuring wink. "Thanks, buddy. You're the best ring bearer a dad could ask for," he said, playfully ruffling Ethan's hair. He was completely unaware of the anxiety that gripped his son's heart. As the first notes of the wedding march filled the room, everyone stood up, their attention fixed on the chapel doors, eagerly waiting for the bride's grand entrance. Everyone except Ethan. His eyes never left his father, and he clutched the ring pillow so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The large wooden doors slowly swung open, and there stood Emily, stunning in a flowing white lace dress. She moved gracefully down the aisle, her golden hair gently falling over her shoulders in soft waves. Her bright blue eyes sparkled with emotion, and as she approached the altar, David's face lit up with nothing but love and admiration. "You look beautiful," David whispered as Emily took her place beside him. Emily smiled softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't wait to start our life together." The officiant began the ceremony, his voice carrying through the chapel. But for young Ethan, every second felt like it dragged on forever. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting between his father and Emily. To most people, his fidgeting might have seemed like simple nerves, but something much deeper was brewing inside the boy. As the ceremony went on, Ethan's mind wandered back to the events of the past few months. He remembered the day his father first introduced him to Emily, the woman who now stood beside him at the altar. It was a clear, crisp autumn afternoon when David had picked Ethan up from school. His dad had been smiling ear to ear, excited in a way that Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. "I've got someone special I want you to meet, buddy," David had said, practically bouncing with excitement as they drove home. Ethan had felt his stomach twist, a blend of curiosity and nervousness swirling inside him. Since his mother's passing 2 years ago, it had just been the two of them. The thought of someone new coming into their lives had filled him with uncertainty. When they pulled into the driveway, Emily was already waiting for them on the porch. The sunlight danced off her golden hair, making her look almost like a picture from a magazine. She smiled warmly as they got out of the car, and Ethan couldn't help but notice how his father's face lit up the moment he saw her. "Ethan, this is Emily," David said, his voice proud and full of emotion. "She's become very important to me, and I hope she'll become important to you too." Emily bent down so that she was at Ethan's eye level, her blue eyes sparkling with kindness. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Ethan," she said gently. "Your dad talks about you all the time." In that moment, Ethan had felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe things wouldn't be so bad after all. But as the weeks went by, the small flicker of hope that Ethan had started with began to fade. He started noticing how different Emily acted when his father wasn't around. Her warm smiles turned into cold, hard stares and tight-lipped frowns. One evening in particular stood out in his mind. David had to stay late at work, so Emily was left to look after Ethan. As they sat at the dinner table, Ethan tried to start a conversation. "Miss Emily," he began nervously, "do you like space? We're learning about the solar system at school, and—" Before he could finish, Emily cut him off, her eyes glued to her phone. "I'm busy right now," she snapped. "Eat your dinner quietly, please." Ethan shrank back in his chair, poking at his food with his fork, the silence in the room suddenly heavy and uncomfortable. When his father was home, though, Emily acted completely different. She would ask Ethan how school was going, laugh at his jokes, and even playfully ruffle his hair. But Ethan could tell her smiles were fake. There was something off, something cold hiding behind her eyes. David, on the other hand, was over the moon. He hadn't seemed this happy in years. He would dance around the house, sometimes breaking out into song, which would have normally embarrassed Ethan, but now it was a relief to see his dad so joyful. "Isn't Emily wonderful?" David would often say, his eyes bright with excitement. "We're so lucky to have her, don't you think, buddy?" Ethan would nod, forcing a smile. He didn't want to take away his dad's happiness, but deep inside, he felt more and more alone. As the weeks turned into months, Emily's true personality started to come through more clearly. When David wasn't around, her comments became sharp and hurtful. If Ethan made a mess while working on a school project, Emily would sigh dramatically, "Oh, Ethan, you're such a handful. I don't know how your father manages with you." Or when Ethan would proudly show her a test score, she'd respond flatly, "That's nice, dear, but you know there's always room for improvement." Every comment felt like a small jab, slowly chipping away at Ethan's confidence. He started to feel like he didn't belong in his own home, like he was nothing but a burden. To avoid her, he began spending more time in his room, staying away from the shared spaces in the house as much as he could. Then one Saturday afternoon, about 3 months before the wedding, something happened that Ethan couldn't forget. David had gone out to run some errands, leaving Ethan alone with Emily. Ethan was in the living room, watching cartoons and sipping on a glass of juice when Emily stormed in. "Turn that off," she snapped, motioning toward the TV. "It's too loud. I'm trying to work." Startled, Ethan fumbled for the remote, accidentally knocking over his glass of juice in the process. The liquid spilled all over the coffee table and the carpet. "I'm sorry," he cried, jumping up to grab some napkins. "I didn't mean to—" Before he could finish, Emily was already there, her fingers digging painfully into his arm as she yanked him away from the spill. "Look what you've done," she hissed, her face twisted in fury. "You clumsy, careless boy." Ethan winced as her grip tightened, tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whimpered, his voice shaking. "I'll clean it up, I promise." Emily's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You better," she growled. "And if you tell your father about this, you'll be very, very sorry. Do you understand me?" Ethan nodded quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. As soon as she let go, he rushed to clean up the mess, his hands trembling as he wiped away the spilled juice. That night, when David came home, Emily greeted him with a cheerful smile and a kiss, as if nothing had happened. "How was your day, honey?" she asked sweetly. Ethan watched from the stairs, rubbing his arm where Emily had grabbed him, feeling more isolated than ever. As the wedding day grew closer, Ethan found himself weighed down by the burden of his secret. He wanted so badly to tell his father the truth about Emily, but fear kept him silent. What if his dad didn't believe him? What if Emily's anger got worse? One evening, about a month before the wedding, Ethan finally gathered the courage to speak up. David was in his study, going over some paperwork, when Ethan knocked on the door. "Come in, buddy," David called out, smiling as Ethan stepped inside. "What's up?" Ethan hesitated, twisting the hem of his shirt in his hands. "Dad," he started slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "can I talk to you?" "Once we get the money," Emily's voice trailed off, but those words were enough to make Ethan's heart pound even harder. He crouched lower, trying to make himself invisible as he peeked around the corner. His mind raced. Insurance policy? Phase 2? What was she planning? Asterisk, asterisk. He had heard enough to know this was bad, really bad. Emily wasn't just mean to him when his dad wasn't around. There was something much darker at play. His stomach churned with fear and dread, and he quickly backed away, tiptoeing down the hallway, praying Emily wouldn't see or hear him. His little feet moved as quietly as possible until he made it back to his room, where he closed the door softly behind him and leaned against it, trying to calm his racing thoughts. For the rest of the night, sleep didn't come. Ethan tossed and turned, his mind unable to let go of what he had overheard. The words insurance policy and once we get the money echoed in his head over and over. What did it mean? He felt a tight knot in his chest. Something wasn't right. Was Emily planning to hurt his dad? The thought terrified him. The next morning, Ethan could barely look at Emily. Every time she smiled at his father or said something cheerful, he felt sick inside, knowing it was all an act. His dad, as usual, was oblivious to it all, caught up in the excitement of the upcoming wedding. Ethan wanted to tell him. He needed to tell him. But what if his dad didn't believe him again? The last time he tried, David had brushed it off, thinking it was just his son having a hard time adjusting. But this wasn't just about Emily being mean now. This was something far worse, something dangerous. Over breakfast, Ethan picked at his food, too nervous to eat. David noticed and frowned. "You okay, buddy? You seem a little off." Ethan forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine, Dad," he mumbled, his eyes avoiding Emily's. Emily, of course, put on her best concerned expression. "Maybe he's just a little nervous about the wedding," she said sweetly, reaching over to pat Ethan's hand. He fought the urge to pull away. Her touch made his skin crawl. "I'm sure it's just that," David said, clearly not noticing anything out of the ordinary. "But don't worry, kiddo. Everything's going to be great. You'll see." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. He wanted so badly to tell his dad everything, about the way Emily treated him, about what he overheard last night. But he was scared. What if David didn't believe him? What if things only got worse after that? The days leading up to the wedding dragged on. Ethan became quieter, retreating more and more into himself. He tried to avoid Emily as much as possible, but it was hard when she was always around, pretending to be the perfect fiancée. Meanwhile, the wedding preparations continued at full speed. Ethan felt trapped, like he was stuck in a nightmare with no way out. Then, just a few days before the wedding, something unexpected happened. Ethan was in his room, sitting on the floor, pretending to work on a school project, but really just trying to keep his mind off of everything. The door creaked open, and his father walked in, looking concerned. "Hey, bud," David said, sitting down beside him. "I've noticed you've been really quiet lately. Is something going on? You can tell me, you know." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was his chance. He wanted to spill everything, to tell his dad about Emily's true nature, about the phone call, about the things he had overheard. But as he looked into his father's kind, trusting eyes, fear took over again. What if David thought he was making it up? What if it only made things worse? He took a deep breath, trying to push the words out. I'm just nervous about the wedding," Ethan lied, his voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, not pressing him further. "I get that, buddy. It's a big change, but I promise, everything's going to be okay." He ruffled Ethan's hair affectionately before getting up to leave. "If you need to talk, I'm always here, okay?" Ethan nodded, his heart heavy with guilt. He had missed his chance. As his dad walked out of the room, Ethan felt even more hopeless than before. He had tried to speak up once, and his dad hadn't believed him. Now, the weight of what he knew pressed down on him, suffocating him. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he realized he couldn't stay silent anymore. He had to do something. The wedding was only days away, and if he didn't act soon, it might be too late. He didn't fully understand what Emily's plan was, but he knew enough to know that his dad was in danger. The next morning, Ethan made up his mind. He would find a way to stop the wedding. He wasn't sure how he'd do it yet, but he couldn't let Emily go through with whatever scheme she was plotting. His dad's life might depend on it. We'll be set for life. No more scams, no more close calls. This is our ticket out. Emily's voice hissed through the phone, making Ethan freeze in place. His breath caught in his throat. Money? Scams? Asterisk, asterisk. He couldn't wrap his mind around what she was saying. But it only got worse as Emily continued, her voice lowering. That brat, Ethan, he's the wild card. He's too observant for his own good. But don't worry, I can handle him. David is wrapped around my finger. He'd never believe a word against his precious fiancée. Ethan's eyes welled with tears. He had always known that Emily didn't like him, but hearing her talk about him like this, like he was just an obstacle to be dealt with, hurt far more than he ever imagined. Emily's voice grew firm, her tone final. Just be ready. 2 weeks after the wedding, we strike. David won't know what hit him. The call ended abruptly, and Ethan scrambled back to his room, his heart racing. He threw himself under his covers, trying to process what he had just heard. Emily was planning something terrible, and it involved his dad, money, and some kind of insurance policy. Ethan didn't fully understand what it all meant, but he knew one thing for sure. His father was in danger. That night, sleep refused to come. Ethan lay in bed, his mind replaying Emily's words again and again. When morning finally came, he stumbled bleary-eyed into the kitchen where David and Emily were already sitting, looking like the perfect happy couple. Morning, champ, David said cheerfully, ruffling Ethan's hair. You look tired, rough night. Ethan nodded, keeping his gaze away from Emily. Just couldn't sleep, he mumbled. Emily's voice cut through the air, sugary sweet with an undertone of something far more sinister. Oh, poor thing, she cooed. Probably just excited about the wedding. Aren't you, Ethan? For a brief moment, Ethan looked up and met her gaze. Behind her smile, he saw a flash of something cold and calculating, and it sent a chill down his spine. Yeah, excited. He lied, forcing a small, weak smile. In the days that followed, Ethan watched Emily like a hawk. Now that he knew something wasn't right, he started noticing things he had overlooked before. Emily was always on her phone, typing furiously. But whenever David came into the room, she locked the screen and plastered on a smile. Just chatting with the wedding planner, honey, she'd say casually. Or, bridesmaid drama. But Ethan knew better now. He caught glimpses of her screen occasionally. Text to someone saved as M in her contacts. Mark. He was sure of it. It had to be the same man from the phone call. Emily also started disappearing from the house more often. She'd come up with flimsy excuses like just popping out to finalize some wedding details, or meeting the girls for a last-minute dress fitting. David, completely in love and distracted by both work and the wedding, didn't question her. But Ethan noticed. He noticed everything. Then one afternoon, about a week before the wedding, Ethan was helping his dad fix the lawnmower in the garage when Emily pulled into the driveway. She hurried inside, without even acknowledging them. I'm going to grab a snack, Dad, Ethan said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. David, still focused on the lawnmower, nodded. Sure thing, buddy. Bring me a soda while you're at it, will you? Ethan made his way into the house quietly. But as he approached the stairs, he heard Emily's muffled voice from upstairs. Moving carefully, he climbed the stairs, making sure to avoid the third step that always creaked. As he neared the guest room, soon to be Emily and David's room, he could hear her clearly now. Almost there, Mark, Emily was saying. Just a few more days. Keep your shirt on. Ethan inched closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The policy is ironclad, she continued. Once we're married, it'll be easy. A tragic accident, a grieving widow, and we're set for life. Just stick to the plan. Ethan's blood ran cold. A tragic accident. Were they planning to hurt his dad? Panic washed over him. But before he could process it, Emily's voice dropped lower. Desperate to hear, Ethan leaned closer to the door. In his eagerness, he bumped against it, causing the wood to creak slightly. The room went silent. Ethan's heart raced as he scrambled backward. He could hear Emily's voice, suddenly sharp. "I've got to go," she said quickly. "I'll call you later." Ethan darted down the hallway, ducking into the bathroom just as the guest room door opened. He heard Emily's footsteps pause outside the bathroom door for a moment, and he held his breath, hoping she wouldn't check on him. After a few tense seconds, he heard her slowly make her way downstairs. Breathing heavily, Ethan slumped against the bathroom wall. This was far worse than he had imagined. Emily and this marked person weren't just after money. They were planning to hurt his dad. Maybe even no. He couldn't think about that. But the fear gripped him, and for a long time, he sat there in the bathroom, his mind whirling. He had to do something, but what? No one would believe him. Not his dad, not anyone. But he couldn't just sit by and let Emily go through with whatever terrible plan she had in mind. He wiped the tears from his eyes and stood up. He had to stop the wedding. No matter what it took, he had to protect his dad. Dad, even if no one believed him. But how could an 8-year-old boy outsmart two adults who were so deep in their plan? The thought was overwhelming, but he knew he couldn't let fear stop him. His dad's life depended on it. For the next few days, Ethan was on edge. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and every time he saw Emily, it felt like his heart might burst from the anxiety. He knew he had to act fast, but every attempt he made to gather more evidence was a risky game. If Emily even suspected he knew, she might do something before he could stop her. Ethan started to think through his options. Who could he tell? His dad wouldn't believe him, not after all the lies Emily had probably fed him. Maybe a teacher or a neighbor. But every time he thought about it, his mind came back to the same problem. Who would believe a kid? It wasn't like he had solid proof, just a feeling, a few snippets of conversations, and that horrifying PDF with the insurance policy. But it wasn't enough to stop them. Then an idea struck him. The wedding. If he could stop the wedding, maybe he could buy some time. Maybe if he did something big enough, his dad would finally listen. The thought scared him, but he knew it was his only chance. On the morning of the wedding, the house was buzzing with excitement. David was happier than Ethan had ever seen him, going over last-minute details with the officiant and laughing with friends and family who had flown in for the big day. Emily, meanwhile, floated around the house like a queen, giving orders and making sure everything was perfect. But to Ethan, she looked different, more tense, as if the weight of what was about to happen was finally starting to show. Ethan stayed quiet, biding his time. He kept replaying the plan in his head over and over, hoping that when the moment came, he would have the courage to go through with it. As guests started arriving at the small chapel, Ethan hung back, keeping his eyes on Emily the entire time. She moved gracefully, her smile never wavering. But Ethan could see through the act. He knew her secret. When it was finally time for the ceremony to begin, Ethan took his place as the ring bearer, standing at the front beside his dad. His hands were shaking, but he tried to stay calm. He could feel the weight of the ring pillow in his hands and knew this was it, his last chance to stop everything. As Emily walked down the aisle in her stunning white dress, everyone in the room watched her with admiration. Everyone except Ethan. His heart was pounding so hard, he thought it might explode. When Emily reached the altar and the officiant began speaking, Ethan knew it was now or never. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. Asterisk, asterisk, stop. Asterisk, asterisk, he shouted, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Everyone froze, their eyes snapping to the young boy standing in front of them. His dad looked down at him in confusion. "What is it, buddy?" David asked, a nervous laugh in his voice, as if trying to brush it off. But Ethan didn't back down. "You can't marry her, Dad. She's lying to you." The room fell into stunned silence. Ethan's small voice echoed off the chapel walls. Emily's face went pale, but she quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing as she forced a smile. "Oh, Ethan, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I know this is hard for you, but we've talked about this." "No," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "She's lying. She doesn't love you. She's planning to hurt you for the insurance money." The crowd gasped, and David's face filled with confusion and disbelief. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he stood his ground. "I heard her. I saw the files on her laptop. She's working with some guy named Mark, and they're going to make it look like an accident. After the wedding, they're going to hurt you, Dad." David's face went pale, and for a moment he seemed frozen in place. He looked at Ethan, then at Emily, who was now glaring at the boy with a mix of anger and fear. "That's ridiculous," Emily said, her voice shaking slightly. "He's just a child. He doesn't understand. He's making it up because he doesn't want us to be together." But Ethan saw the panic in her eyes, and so did everyone else. David turned to Emily, his face filled with doubt. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily's mask of calm finally cracked. "David, you can't seriously believe this," she began, but David held up his hand to silence her. The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan held his breath, hoping his dad would finally see the truth. David stared at Emily for what felt like an eternity before finally speaking. "I need you to tell me the truth, Emily," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Did you take out an insurance policy on me? And who is Mark?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was written all over her face, and everyone could see it. David turned back to Ethan, his eyes filled with shock and betrayal. He didn't say anything, but the look on his face said it all. He believed his son. Finally, Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, relief washing over him. He had done it. He had stopped the wedding, and more importantly, he had saved his dad. Emily's eyes darted around the room, her carefully constructed mask of calm finally starting to fall apart. Her breathing grew rapid as she realized everyone was watching her, waiting for her to respond. David stood frozen, his eyes searching hers for answers, while Ethan stood firm, though his heart raced with fear. "David, Emily stammered, her voice faltering. This is insane. I would never do anything to hurt you." But the cracks in her voice, the way she avoided looking directly at David, said otherwise. David took a step back, his face pale. "Then explain the insurance policy, Emily. Explain why my son thinks you and some man named Mark are planning something behind my back." For a moment, Emily looked like she was going to continue the lie, her lips parting as if to protest. But then, seeing the suspicion and fear in David's eyes, she seemed to realize there was no way out. Her shoulders slumped, and she dropped her act completely. Her voice, now cold and devoid of the false sweetness she had worn so easily before, said, "David, you weren't supposed to know." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and David's eyes filled with shock. "So it's true," he whispered. "You were going to hurt me? After everything?" Emily's face twisted with a mixture of regret and bitterness. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. You were never supposed to find out. Mark and I, we needed the money. And you were too easy. Always so trusting, so gullible." She sneered, the last vestige of her calm demeanor gone. "You believed everything I told you." David's expression darkened with hurt, betrayal, and anger. "I loved you," he said, his voice cracking. "I trusted you." At that moment, Emily's eyes flickered with something like pity, but it was fleeting. "David, love doesn't pay the bills," she spat bitterly. "Mark and I, we had plans. I wasn't going to kill you, not directly. But accidents happen, you know." The weight of her words crushed the room. Guests stared in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The cheerful atmosphere of the wedding was now drenched in betrayal and deceit. David turned to Ethan, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he said softly. "I should have listened to you. I should have believed you." Ethan, his own tears brimming, shook his head. "It's okay, Dad. I just didn't want anything bad to happen to you." David pulled Ethan into a tight hug, holding him close as if to shield him from the darkness that had nearly engulfed their lives. "You saved me," David whispered into his son's hair. "You really saved me." Emily, realizing the gravity of her situation, took a step back, her eyes wild with desperation. "David, wait. But it was too late. The guests, horrified by her confession, began murmuring louder, some of them even standing to leave. The once joyful occasion had turned into a nightmare. David looked at her one last time, his voice filled with cold resolve. "You're done, Emily. This wedding is over, and so are we." Emily's face paled further, and she looked like she might protest again. But then she seemed to realize there was no point. With a final, bitter glance at David and Ethan, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the church, the door slamming shut behind her. As the noise in the church slowly died down, David knelt in front of Ethan once again, cupping his son's face in his hands. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You're the bravest kid I know." Ethan hugged his dad tightly, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. Emily was gone, and his dad was safe. Though the pain of betrayal still hung heavy in the air, one thing was certain. Ethan had done the right thing. He had saved his dad's life, and they would face whatever came next together. David's fingers trembled as he punched in the numbers, his mind spinning with the shocking events that had just unfolded. The crowd in the church was a whirlwind of confusion and whispers, but all David could focus on was a betrayal that had ripped through his life in a matter of minutes. He barely heard the operator's voice on the other end of the line. 911, what's your emergency? David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "My fiancée. She just fled from our wedding. She's involved in some kind of plot to hurt me. I need someone here now." As David explained the situation, the church was still in a state of disarray. Guests were either huddled in groups, murmuring to each other in disbelief, or making their way out the doors, shaken by what they had witnessed. Some tried to comfort David, but he brushed them off, focused solely on his son and the conversation with the emergency operator. Ethan stood quietly by his dad's side, his small body still trembling from the confrontation. Though he felt an overwhelming sense of relief that his father had finally believed him, the weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily on his young shoulders. David knelt down beside Ethan, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have listened to you sooner." Ethan hugged his father back, feeling the warmth and safety he had been craving. "It's okay, Dad. I just didn't want her to hurt you." After hanging up the phone, David stood, his face set with determination. He turned to the guests who were still milling around the church. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice steady but weary. "But this wedding, it's over. The police are on their way." People began to file out, many of them still shaking their heads in disbelief. A few close friends stayed behind, offering their support, but David was too drained to respond to them. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Emily, of how he had been so blind to the truth, and of how dangerously close he had come to losing everything. Just as the last of the guests exited the church, the sound of police sirens blared from outside. Moments later, 2 officers entered, their expressions serious as they approached David. "Sir, we received a report of a disturbance. Can you tell us what happened?" David nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Yes, my fiancée, Emily. She's been planning something against me. My son overheard her talking about an insurance scam and, well, she just ran out of here when she was confronted." One of the officers nodded, taking notes as David spoke. "Do you have any idea where she might have gone?" David shook his head, feeling the weight of the day crushing him. "No, I don't. But please, find her. She's dangerous." The officer glanced over at Ethan, who was standing quietly by his father's side, and offered a reassuring nod. "We'll do our best, sir. We'll need to take statements from both of you, and we'll put out an APB on your fiancée. If she's still in the area, we'll find her." As the officers began to question David and Ethan further, the reality of the situation began to settle in. Emily had vanished into the chaos, but the truth of her deceit was now out in the open. Ethan had saved his father, and while there was still so much to process, one thing was certain. Their lives would never be the same again. Later that evening, after the police had left and the house was quiet, David sat beside Ethan on the couch, staring at the floor. The weight of everything that had happened finally hit him full force. "I can't believe I didn't see it," he muttered, mostly to himself. Ethan looked up at his dad, his voice soft but full of understanding. "You couldn't have known, Dad. She was really good at pretending." David nodded, tears welling in his eyes as he looked down at his son. "You're right, but I should have trusted you. I should have believed you from the start." Ethan leaned into his father, feeling the warmth of his embrace. "It's okay, Dad. We're safe now. That's what matters." David hugged Ethan tightly, thankful beyond words for his son's courage. They had both faced something no one should ever have to go through, but together they would heal. As the night wore on, the house remained quiet, but the shadows of what could have been lingered in every corner. David knew that it would take time to rebuild their lives, to trust again, but with Ethan by his side, he felt stronger. Together, they had faced the unthinkable and come out the other side. In the days that followed, the search for Emily continued, but she seemed to have vanished without a trace. The police kept David updated, but as time passed, it became clear that finding her would not be easy. However, David knew one thing for certain. Emily's plans had been stopped, and thanks to Ethan, he had been spared from a future of unimaginable pain. Father and son, bound closer than ever by the ordeal, were ready to move forward, knowing that the worst was behind them. Return home. The air outside the church was tense as David and Ethan followed Officer Johnson to the police car. The once joyous atmosphere had completely shifted, leaving behind confusion, shock, and the grim reality of what had just transpired. Ethan glanced back at the church, his mind still racing. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had spiraled. Just hours ago, his dad had been preparing for what he thought would be the happiest day of his life, and now they were heading to the police station, trying to unravel a deadly plot. It all felt surreal. As they drove toward the station, David remained silent, his hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan could feel the weight of everything pressing down on his dad, and he wished he could do more to take that burden away. He had saved his father's life, but now, seeing the pain etched on David's face, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. He hadn't wanted to ruin his dad's happiness. He just wanted to keep him safe. When they arrived at the police station, Officer Johnson led them inside, guiding them to a small, sterile-looking room. The walls were bare, and the fluorescent lighting buzzed faintly overhead. David sat beside Ethan, who fidgeted nervously in his chair. "All right, Mr. Matthews," Officer Johnson said as he took a seat across from them, flipping open a notepad. "We'll need you both to go over everything from the beginning. We'll also want to collect any evidence you have, texts, photos, anything that can help us piece this together." David nodded, his voice shaky but determined. "Of course. I'll tell you everything." Ethan sat quietly, listening as his father recounted how he had met Emily, how everything had seemed perfect at first, and how he had trusted her completely. The sadness in his dad's voice was clear, and Ethan's heart ached for him. Then, David began to talk about how Ethan had come to him with concerns, how he had overheard conversations and found suspicious files on Emily's computer. The officers listened intently, taking notes as David explained how Ethan had bravely stepped forward during the wedding to stop what could have been a deadly plan. As David finished, Officer Johnson leaned forward, his expression serious. "Your son's bravery is commendable, Mr. Matthews. Most kids wouldn't have the courage to do what he did." David glanced at Ethan, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. He saved my life, David said quietly, pride and love filling his voice. I'm just glad I listened before it was too late. Officer Johnson turned his attention to Ethan. Ethan, do you have anything you'd like to add? Anything else you remember that might help us catch Emily and this Mark person? Ethan took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I heard Emily talking to Mark on the phone, and she said something about an insurance policy. It was for millions of dollars, and they were going to make it look like an accident after the wedding. He paused, looking at his dad for reassurance before continuing. I also saw pictures of Emily and Mark together on her computer. They looked like they were close. I don't think Mark is just a wedding planner, like she said. Officer Johnson nodded, writing down Ethan's words. That's helpful, Ethan. We'll need to look at that laptop and any files you can find. Just as Officer Johnson finished, Officer Rivera entered the room, a look of frustration on his face. Mark got away, he said grimly. We lost him in the chase, but we've put out an APB. Every officer in the area is on the lookout. David's face fell, and Ethan felt a wave of fear wash over him. Mark was still out there, and so was Emily. We'll catch them, Officer Rivera assured them. But in the meantime, we're going to do everything we can to keep you and your son safe, Mr. Matthews. We can provide protection, and we'll stay in touch as the investigation progresses. David nodded, though his worry was clear. I just want this to be over. I don't want Ethan to have to live in fear. We understand, Officer Johnson said, standing up. For now, we'll make sure you both get home safely, and we'll start working on this case immediately. You've done the right thing by coming forward. As they were escorted out of the station, Ethan felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. The danger wasn't over yet, but at least they had taken the first steps to stop Emily and Mark. As they got back into the car, Ethan glanced up at his dad, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. Are we going to be okay, Dad? Ethan asked softly. David turned to him, his expression softening. Yeah, buddy, we're going to be okay. We'll get through this together. Ethan leaned back in his seat, feeling a little more reassured. It wasn't the end of the road yet, but as long as they had each other, he knew they would make it through whatever came next. Feeling the weight of the day settle in, the relief of knowing that Mark had been caught was overshadowed by the reality that Emily, or rather, Sarah Connor, was still out there. As they left the police station and stepped into the cool evening air, Ethan glanced up at his father. David looked exhausted, the weight of betrayal etched deeply into his face. But there was also a quiet strength in the way he carried himself now. The ride home was quiet, the hum of the car the only sound as they drove through the darkened streets. Ethan stared out the window, the familiar houses and shops slipping past, but it all felt different now. The world looked the same, but it had shifted. Everything he had known about trust, love, and family had been shaken to its core. When they finally pulled into their driveway, David turned off the car and sat for a moment in silence. I don't know how we're going to move on from this, he said softly, his voice heavy with exhaustion and sorrow. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt and looked at his dad. We will, Dad, he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he fully believed it himself. We'll figure it out together. David smiled, a faint but genuine smile, and nodded. Yeah, we will. Together. They walked into the house. The familiar creak of the front door a small comfort after the chaos of the day. Everything inside was as they had left it, yet it felt strangely empty without the shadow of Emily looming over them. David flicked on the lights, the soft glow filling the living room. Ethan went to sit on the couch, feeling the weight of the day catch up to him. His body ached from the tension, and his mind was racing with everything that had happened. He couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to something terrible. If he hadn't overheard that phone call, if he hadn't spoken up when he did, his dad might not be sitting beside him now. David sat down next to Ethan, letting out a long breath as he leaned back. I still can't believe it, he said, staring at the ceiling. I was so blind. I let her into our lives, and she almost took everything from us. Ethan looked over at his dad, seeing the guilt and pain in his eyes. "It's not your fault, Dad. She tricked you. She tricked both of us." David shook his head, his voice low. "I should have seen it. I should have listened to you when you first told me something was wrong." Ethan hesitated, then leaned over and hugged his dad tightly. "But you did listen, Dad. When it mattered, you believed me. That's what counts." David hugged Ethan back, and for a moment, they sat there in silence, holding on to each other as the reality of their situation settled in. After a while, David pulled back and looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved my life, Ethan. I don't know how to thank you for that." Ethan shrugged, feeling a little awkward at the praise. "I just didn't want anything bad to happen to you." David smiled and ruffled Ethan's hair. "Well, you're a hero in my book." The night passed quietly, with both of them trying to shake off the events of the day. But even as they tried to relax, the fear of what might come next lingered. Emily, or Sarah, was still out there, and as much as they wanted to believe the police would catch her, the uncertainty gnawed at them. Later that night, as Ethan lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. His mind kept replaying everything that had happened, from the moment he had first grown suspicious of Emily to the chaos of the wedding. He felt a sense of relief knowing Mark was behind bars, but the thought of Emily still being on the run filled him with unease. He turned over in bed, pulling the blankets tighter around him, and whispered into the dark, "Please don't let her find us." Down the hall, David sat on the edge of his bed, the weight of the day finally sinking in. He glanced at his phone, Officer Johnson's card sitting next to it on the nightstand. He knew the days ahead would be filled with more questions, more police interviews, and likely a lot more emotional healing. But for now, all he wanted was to make sure Ethan felt safe. With a deep sigh, he lay down, hoping that tomorrow would bring a little more peace. As he closed his eyes, he couldn't help but think about how close he had come to losing everything, and how his son's bravery had saved them both. Ethan was sitting at the table, finishing his cereal. Jack smiled warmly at Ethan, then turned back to David with concern in his eyes. "Hey, champ," Jack greeted, giving Ethan a playful pat on the back. "How you doing, kiddo?" Ethan shrugged, trying to act nonchalant. "I'm okay," he said, though his eyes betrayed a hint of lingering anxiety. David motioned for Jack to sit down, offering him a cup of coffee. "It's been rough," David admitted, sitting down beside Jack. "But we're getting through it slowly." Jack took a sip of his coffee, leaning back in the chair. "I've been thinking about you guys a lot. It's not every day that something like that happens. I just wanted to check in, make sure you're doing all right." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We're trying to get back to normal, whatever that is. But it's hard. Emily, or Sarah, or whatever her real name is, she left such a mess behind. The police are still trying to track her down, but she's like a ghost, and I can't help but feel like we're not safe until she's found." Jack nodded sympathetically. "I can't even imagine. I mean, the fact that she was so close to pulling off something so dangerous. It's chilling, but you did the right thing, David. You listened to Ethan, and you stopped her before it was too late." David glanced over at Ethan, who was quietly listening. "Yeah, Ethan's the real hero here," David said, pride filling his voice. "I don't know what I would have done without him." Ethan blushed slightly, looking down at his bowl. "I just didn't want anything bad to happen," he mumbled. Jack leaned forward, giving Ethan a serious look. "You did something brave, kid. You should be proud of that. Not a lot of people, even grown-ups, would have had the courage to do what you did." Ethan looked up at Jack, giving him a small smile. "Thanks." David cleared his throat, turning the conversation away from the past. "So, what brings you by, Jack?" "Just checking in." Jack hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Actually, I have some news. Good news, I think." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table to David. David raised an eyebrow and opened the envelope. Inside was a check, a significant amount of money written in his name. His eyes widened as he read the note attached. What is this? David asked, looking up at Jack in disbelief. Jack grinned. Well, some of the guests from the wedding felt awful about what happened. I mean, they saw it all unfold, and they were just as shocked as you. A few of them decided to pool together some money as a way to help you get back on your feet after everything that's happened. It's not much, but we figured it could help with the legal fees, the security systems, and anything else you might need. David's eyes filled with emotion. I don't know what to say. I wasn't expecting anything like this. Jack smiled and shrugged. You don't have to say anything, man. You've been through enough. Just take it and use it for whatever you need. We all care about you and Ethan. We want to make sure you're okay. David stood up and hugged Jack tightly, overwhelmed by the kindness of his friends. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. This means more than you know. Jack patted him on the back. You do the same for any of us. As David sat back down, he looked at Ethan, who was smiling now. See, buddy, we're not alone in this. We've got people looking out for us. Ethan nodded, feeling a little lighter. The weight of the past few weeks had been heavy, but knowing that they had friends who cared made it feel a bit more manageable. Jack stayed for a while, chatting with David and Ethan, filling the kitchen with laughter and warmth. For the first time in weeks, it felt like they were on their way to healing. The specter of Emily still loomed over them, but with the support of their friends and the bond they shared, they knew they could face whatever came next together. As Jack was leaving, he turned to David and smiled. You've got a strong kid there, David. You two are going to be just fine. David smiled, nodding in agreement. Yeah, we will. Thanks for everything, Jack. With a wave, Jack headed out the door, leaving David and Ethan standing together in the quiet of their home. They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but they knew that, no matter what, they'd always have each other. And that was enough. David sat in stunned silence, his arm protectively around Ethan's shoulders, trying to process the weight of Officer Johnson's words. The news hit like a wave, crashing over him with a mixture of shock, sadness, and an odd sense of finality. Emily, or Sarah, was gone. The woman who had once been such a central figure in their lives, the woman who had betrayed and manipulated them, was now dead. Ethan leaned into his father, his small frame trembling slightly. She's gone, Ethan asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, pulling his son closer. Yeah, buddy, she's gone. Officer Johnson cleared his throat, his voice gentle as he continued. I know this is a lot to take in, and I'm sorry to bring such heavy news, but we thought it was important for you both to know. The case is officially closed now, and you won't have to worry about her anymore. David glanced at Ethan, who was staring down at his hands, processing everything in his own way. What happens now? David asked, his voice still shaky. Nothing else from a legal standpoint, Officer Johnson replied. The authorities will handle the rest. If you need support, we can refer you to counselors who specialize in this sort of thing. It's not easy dealing with something like this, especially for someone as young as Ethan. David nodded, but his focus was on his son. Thank you, Officer Johnson. We appreciate everything you've done for us. Officer Johnson stood, offering a sympathetic smile. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help. After the officer left, the house fell into a heavy, quiet stillness. David sat beside Ethan, rubbing his son's back gently. How are you feeling? He asked, trying to gauge his son's emotions. Ethan shrugged, still processing the news. I don't know. I feel weird, like I should feel something, but I don't know what. David nodded, understanding his son's confusion. It's okay to feel that way. There's no right or wrong way to feel about this. Emily, Sarah, did some terrible things, but it's okay if you're confused about how to react. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at his dad, his eyes wide. Do you think she really felt sorry for what she did? David sighed, his heart heavy. I don't know, Ethan. Maybe. It sounds like she was struggling, but even if she felt guilty, it doesn't change what happened or what she put us through. Ethan nodded, but the question still lingered in his mind. I don't hate her anymore, he said quietly. I just feel bad for her. David's chest tightened at his son's words. He was proud of Ethan for his compassion, but also sad that his son had to navigate such complex emotions at such a young age. That's okay, buddy. It's okay to feel bad for her. It means you have a big heart. Ethan leaned into his dad's side again, seeking comfort in the familiar warmth. Does this mean it's all over now? He asked, his voice small. David wrapped his arm tighter around Ethan. Yeah, it's over. We can move on now. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past months slowly lifting. Though the news of Emily's death was shocking, it also marked the end of a long, painful chapter in their lives. The fear of her returning was gone, and with it came a strange sense of relief, even if it was tinged with sadness. In the days that followed, David and Ethan tried to find a new rhythm. Life began to move forward again, but this time with a renewed sense of peace. The shadow that Emily had cast over their lives was finally gone, and though the wound she left behind would take time to heal, they both knew they could face the future together, stronger than ever. David continued to be there for Ethan, always ready to talk when his son needed to process the emotions that still lingered. They spent more time outdoors, hiking and fishing, creating new memories to replace the old ones that had been tainted by Emily's deceit. And as they moved forward, they did so with the knowledge that they had faced something terrible and come out the other side more resilient and united than ever before. As David carried Ethan into the house, the peaceful rhythm of their lives began to fully take root. The past year, filled with trials and revelations, had made them stronger, and the quiet moments now felt more precious than ever. David laid Ethan down on his bed, pulling the blanket up over his son's small shoulders, and stood for a moment, simply watching him sleep. His heart swelled with love and gratitude. He reflected on how much they had both been through, how Ethan, his brave and perceptive son, had saved his life in ways he never could have imagined. It wasn't just about stopping the wedding or exposing Emily's deception. Ethan had pulled David back into the world of trust, love, and authentic connection. David softly closed Ethan's door and headed into the kitchen, where he stood by the window, looking up at the starry night sky. He thought about how uncertain the future still was, but the fear that had once haunted him was gone. They had faced something huge, something dark and terrifying, and come out stronger. Whatever lay ahead, David knew they could handle it together. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Ethan woke up to the smell of breakfast cooking. He smiled, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and headed to the kitchen, where his dad was flipping pancakes, whistling a cheerful tune. "Morning, buddy," David greeted, smiling warmly as Ethan sat down at the table. "How'd you sleep?" "Great," Ethan said, grinning as he watched his dad set a stack of pancakes in front of him. "What's the plan for today?" David sat across from him, a thoughtful look on his face. "I was thinking, how about we make today an adventure day? We can go to that museum you've been wanting to visit, grab lunch at your favorite place, and maybe catch a movie afterward. What do you think?" Ethan's eyes lit up with excitement. "That sounds awesome, Dad." As they enjoyed breakfast, David couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. Their lives had settled into a new rhythm, one built on trust, communication, and the bond they shared. The days of uncertainty, fear, and betrayal were behind them, and in their place was the simple, powerful joy of being together. Ethan had become a symbol of courage in their community, and the story of how he stopped his father's wedding had spread far and wide. But to David, the real story wasn't about the dramatic moment at the wedding. It was about the love they had nurtured in the aftermath, the quiet moments, the laughter, the shared adventures, and the unspoken understanding that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. As the day unfolded, filled with new memories and laughter, David and Ethan knew that their story was far from over. The journey of father and son, their resilience, love, and strength, was just beginning, and whatever the future held, They would face it, side by side, with the knowledge that together they could overcome anything,